Not too long ago, I put out a video where I discussed authentication, JWTs, how it all works, and in that video, I came to the conclusion that I would recommend you don't use custom authentication and instead go with some authentication provider like Auth0 or Clerk or Firebase or whatever you want to use. But over time, I've kind of soured on that, and while I don't think I've fully gone back on it, and I think there still is a place to use an authentication provider, I've warmed up a lot more to custom authentication. So in this video, I want to give you an example of implementing a form of custom authentication with a GoLang backend, a SvelteKit front end, and just kind of give you my thoughts on it at the end. So without further ado, let's get into what we're actually building. So before I show you the code, I first want to show you a high-level overview of what this is, what the sort of structure of our app and our server and all this stuff is going to look like. Well, first we need to build out that diagram. And there we have it. This is the high-level overview of the architecture that we're going to be using for this silly little example app. Now, what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be implementing something called session-based authentication. I'll link a couple articles down below, which will give you a deeper understanding of it, because this isn't going to be a video going deep into session authentication versus token authentication. But the gist of it is when the user logs in, they make a request to a server. When they hit that server, they're going to send back down. That server is going to authenticate them, and then the server will send down a session ID, because what the server's done is it's created a session which is stored in memory or a database or something on the server, and then using that session they can hold stuff like the user's information. It can store their like name, first name, last name, ID, all that stuff. It's the kind of thing that would normally be sent down in a JWT, but instead of storing it on the client, we're just storing it on the server. So the only thing that the client gets access to is a session ID. This has a variety of benefits. It makes it so that you can manage all of your sessions obviously on the server. So if you want to invalidate a session, it's really easy. You can just wipe out that session within your database. Although this does result in some scalability concerns, because obviously your authentication and all of your methods rely on some data storage, because you have to store that data on the server, versus with a JWT you just store that on the client. So it's nothing but trade-offs, like basically everything. So I mainly just wanted to use it because it's a little different and I haven't seen too much on it. So we're going to be doing session-based authentication, and how does that actually work in this application? So what you can see right here obviously is we have our SvelteKit front end. So I separated this out into the front end and the back end. Now of course SvelteKit is one framework. We can consider this one block within our diagram, but I split this up because we want to be conscious of where different things are going to be run within our application. That's going to be pretty important, and this is a concept that I think is super important for everyone to understand with the way the modern web is going. Even if you have a separate backend like Go or a Laravel backend or whatever you want to do, realistically, you're going to end up probably using some sort of meta framework for your front end, like SvelteKit, like Solid Start, Next.js, Nuxt.js, etc. And the reason for that is because you want to have these server-side capabilities. You want a server that's directly attached to your application, which will allow you to do things like server-side rendering. It'll allow you to do data fetching on the server and then send that down for SEO optimization. And you also want to have middlewares on there for authentication checks and stuff like this. It makes your application a lot better, and it gives you built-in routing and all this stuff. So really you're going to have most of these, but we got to be conscious of where things run. So the front end is what's being run on the end user's device. When I go to svelte go custom auth fake app whatever, I'm going to be loading that client side code. So that is what's right here. And then the backend code is what's going to be sitting in Vercel or Cloudflare pages or whatever. And those are the JavaScript functions that would be within our SvelteKit app. Those would be the plus page.server.ts files or whatever. All of that is executed on those servers, or they're the API endpoints that we can create in our Svelte app. So we want to make sure that those two are separate and we know where those things are headed. So let's start with the life cycle of a login request. What happens when I log into this app? So I'm going to load into my SvelteKit front end app, and I'm going to go to /login or sign in or whatever I called it. And then I'm going to make a request. I'm going to fill in my email, my password, and then I'm going to hit send. And that is going to be sent to the SvelteKit backend. So the first thing we do is we send it from here to here. So that's getting sent up to the SvelteKit backend. Let me switch the color here. Okay, so we send it up to the SvelteKit backend, and that is what's going to actually end up communicating with our GoFiber backend, and there's a reason for that. So once we do that, we need to actually send this up to our GoLang backend to check it. So we take that here, we send it out to this backend, and then this backend is going to validate that. I'll show you that code later, but within here, we're going to validate this code to ensure that, you know, they are who they say they are, their email is correct, and their password is correct. We're going to be hashing the password password using the bcrypt library. Obviously, you should never be storing your passwords in plain text within your database. So we put that up into our GoLang Fiber backend. Then we're going to have to, do the checks. So the checks are going to require us going to our Postgres database. We have to make a query here where we select all of the information for the user. We fetch that information, and then Postgres will send it back to our GoLang API. So then it'll get that, it'll check it, and assuming if it's right, then they can log in. And now, how do we actually log in? Remember, we're doing session-based authentication. So that means that we need to create a session for the user, and we're going to store those sessions within a Redis database. So Redis is a key value store. It's a hyper-performant memory database. It is stupidly fast, way faster than SQL or anything like that. But the reason why you wouldn't use that as your main database is because it lacks a lot of the really powerful features that Postgres has or MySQL has or whatever. It's very much typically used for like queues or whatever, and it's used to just store key value pairs. So right here we have a really clean key value pair of our key is the session ID and our value is the user's information, which would be their first name, last name, ID, and email in this example. So once I've done that, I'm going to send out to my Redis DB. I'm going to say, okay, I need to save this. I'll be like, great, you did that. And now I have my session ID generated, and I can send that back down to my SvelteKit app. Now, when I send this down, this is when things get tricky, is we want to make sure that we're doing this in a secure manner, because you have to realize what we just created is effectively a key to our app. This session ID can be used to get to anything. This is really important, because if anyone got access to that session ID, they could impersonate that user and do anything that the user does. It doesn't really matter for a silly little to-do app, but imagine this is a bank app. That's a really big deal if you can get someone's session ID for a bank. And that's why you get logged out so quickly from bank apps, is they're invalidating your sessions to ensure that no one else can get into your account and no one can steal it and then use it. So what we're going to do there is we're going to send this down actually as a header. So this is going to, I'll make a note of this here. So we send session ID as a header. Now, some of you who are more experienced are likely confused by this, because typically speaking, the general dogma with sessions and stuff is to send them down as cookies. And the reason for that is because we can do security on the cookies and that kind of thing. But you have to remember, we are in Meta Framework Bizarro weird world. So we can send this down as a header, and then we're going to set the cookie on the SvelteKit backend. So we send down the session ID as an authorization header. We pull that out once on the response from the SvelteKit backend, and then we're going to set a cookie. But we're going to be very careful with this cookie, because cookies can be technically accessed from anywhere. There's this thing called cross-site scripting, or all these different things. I'm not a security expert by any stretch of the imagination. Go do detailed reading if you really want to get into it. But the gist of it is we want to make sure that our cookie can't be used by some other site's JavaScript or whatever. So the way we do that is we set the cookie to be HTTP only, and we set it to be secure. So that means that it can only be accessed over HTTPS, and it can only be accessed over through that site. We make sure it's same site, do all that stuff. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take this session ID, we're going to save it to a cookie. We're going to write that cookie to our app itself and send that back down to the front end. So now we've gone through all this stuff, and the cookie is now saved on the front end. We're logged in, and then now anytime the front end makes a request, it can just send that, it'll send that cookie up, and then the SvelteKit backend will pull that cookie out. It'll send that as an authorization header to our GoLang backend, and then we can authenticate it, and we can authenticate our requests. We can get the profile information. It's super clean. I know that this is a little complicated and a little weird, and obviously if we cut out this little man in the middle, it would be quicker. But the reason why I do kind of like, at least on paper, having it work this way with it being a header coming out of here is because this makes it really easy to handle like mobile authentication or something like that. Because now if I had, let's just say we want to throw in, let's say I want to throw in a React Native mobile app over here. So we want to throw that in here. App, well, then it's really easy. We can just use the exact same thing, because we can do secure storage on the native app. I need to do more research on this. Don't take anything I say about mobile authentication or anything that is gospel, but generally speaking, from my understanding, is we can access a secure store on the mobile app, and then we can just grab this header, grab the session ID, and then store that within our native app, and then connect everything up accordingly. So that's a high-level overview of the authentication, and let's take a look at the actual code. The best place to start, I think, is going to be on the Go Fiber server. Now, This is not going to be a full breakdown on the Fiber server itself because this is an ongoing series. Make sure you guys are subscribed to see everything that's going to be coming down the line. And just for today, we're going to be talking about the authentication side of this, but pretty soon I'm going to go into detail on the structure of this, how I structured this app, and how I got everything working super clean and super nice with dependency injection and all that stuff. I'm really a huge fan of the way this is set up. But all of that aside, let's talk about how this actually works. So if you remember from the earlier example in the diagram, what we have to do here is we need to have different routes to handle different behaviors. So let's first take a look at the sign-in route. So I'm just going to go within private handlers users, and then let's go into the sign-in user handler. So let's sign up. We won't talk too much about, yeah, okay. So signing in the user. So what are we doing here? We're going to go ahead and, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to take in the request body, which is going to have the email and password, do all that stuff. We validate it here. And then once we've done that, we need to grab the session ID from this little session manager I built. And I did all of this basically custom. I built this special little, let me do this so VS Code doesn't yell at me. So I made this special little auth package. And then in here, I created a session manager. And the session manager has some really useful methods for managing the sessions within our backend. So up here, our session manager is going to have access to a Redis client and it's going to have access to a Postgres connection. So what we can do in here is we can either generate a session or handle like sign in and stuff like that. So for this method, we're going to be handling sign in. So what I do here is I take in email, password, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to fetch the user right here. This is just using raw SQL and the PGX package. This is something that I'm kind of debating and going to go into more. Go kind of has a data layer problem where there's no Prisma for Go. There's no super nice ORM. For me personally, I'm focused on learning SQL because I think it's one of my weaknesses as a developer. I don't know SQL at a deep level, and it takes me too long to think through the actual syntax of it, even if conceptually I know it very well. So with all that said, we're going to get the user out of the database, check if it's there. If it's not, throw an error. And then we're going to go ahead, use bcrypt to compare the password. You know, nothing too crazy here. Then finally, we set up the session. So remember when I said the session is just some information that we're storing within this Redis database, and it's a key value pair. The key is the session, and then the value is going to be the actual information of that session, which is going to contain the ID, the first name, the last name, and the email. So we set all the session data right here. We go ahead and we set that into our Redis database and we return the session ID. And that's important because we need to send that session ID down to the user. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send down the session ID to the end user right here. So what I do is I set c.response.header.set authorization into the session. And the reason why I'm setting it as a header and not just sending it down as the body or whatever is because in web history and stuff like that, headers are not stored, I believe. I don't know the exact terminology and all this stuff, but it's better to send private stuff over headers. So I send this down over a header, and then now we can consume that on the front end. So let's take a look at the front end. This is the little Svelte to do app that we looked at very recently. So if I go ahead and hit npm run dev, we'll go ahead and get this popped up, hit this, open this up, and we get our basic to do app example, except this time we've got something cool. So we go to /sign in, we get a sign-in page, and this sign-in page will actually do something. So before we run it, let's look at the code. So now that we're in the code, let's take a look at how this actually works. So remember within SvelteKit, we're doing file-based routing, and this is a whole series built around SvelteKit, and Go, and how all these can work together and do all that stuff, really testing out this stack. So if you guys want to see more of that, I have a lot more coming very soon. Make sure you're subscribed. So we'll go into source, and then we go into our roots directory, and let's go check out the sign-in. So I have my server and my Svelte. Remember that distinction earlier. We have the stuff that executes on the client, which is going to be our the stuff within page.svelte. We have the stuff that executes on the server, and that's going to be page.server. So within page.svelte, I just have this form. No JavaScript in here, no state in here, no use state, no nonsense, because Svelte is beautiful, wonderful framework. Absolutely love working with this. And literally all I'm doing is I have this export let form, which I'll talk about later, but it's basically just the result of sending the data up. And then I have this form right here, which just uses forms as the creators of HTML intended, because it turned out that they basically got this crap right back in the 90s. Really they got everything right back then. It's insane. But that is another tangent for another day. But right here, we have our form, and then it's got a method of post. So then whenever we submit this form, it's going to make a post request to this route to /sign-in, and it's going to pass in the email and the password. So if we go to our server, this is where the magic happens. On page.server, SvelteKit provides a couple of different methods that you can provide, and specifically load and actions. Load is what's called on the page load. So whenever I go to /sign-in, this load function is calling. So when I go to /sign-in, if I added in console.log hello, and then we go ahead and do this, I can see right here hello, because I just went to that route and I made a GET request to it. So anytime we load a page, this load function will call. But now once we call this, the reason why I'm actually putting something in here is I want to redirect them if they're already logged in. So what's super nice about this and having this, and the reason why I advocate for using a meta framework or something, is because we can do server-side redirects to ensure that the user never even goes to a page that they shouldn't. So since the user is already logged in, we can just pull the session ID, because remember, we have cookies, we set it as a cookie. So we can just pull out the session ID. If it exists, then okay, they're already logged in, then we just redirect them to me. This stuff isn't actually that hard, and I kind of overestimated it in the past, so it's really kind of trivial to work with this on the front end, especially with a framework like Svelte. Now, the tricky one here is going to be within actions. Actions are the post requests that are handled on the server. And remember, this is server side, not client side. So what we're going to do in here is we're going to get the form data that's passed in. So when we submitted that form, it passed in an email and a password. We pull those out and then we stringify them into JSON. I feel like there's got to be a more elegant way to do this, but I'm stupid and I wrote this at 4 a.m. So yeah, whatever, it works for now. If there's a better way, let me know in the comments. But for now, all we're doing is we're wrapping this up in a body, and then we're going to pass that request up to our sign-in endpoint. So this is hard-coded. Eventually, this will all be taken to production in the future, but until then, I'm just going to hard-code to localhost because it's easier, and I'm making a request to users/sign-in, and that's the route that we just took a look at within the Go app. So now that we've done this, we make a request, we send up the email and password. It's a post request. We send up a content type of application JSON, make sure it parses correctly. And then it's going to validate that. And remember, it'll send back the session ID as a header. So if we got a valid response, then what we can do is we can get the session ID out of the header. So we pull the authorization header out, and then we want to split it up because remember, it's in this bearer format. That's kind of just the way they do it. I don't know why, but it is. So we pull out the bearer format, we grab our session ID out of here, and now we set the cookie. So if you remember earlier, I mentioned that we want to make sure that it needs to be secure and it needs to be HTTP only. What's nice about this is SvelteKit is smart. It's smarter than me. So when you hover over set, you can read the docs here. It'll say HTTP only and secure options are true by default, except on localhost, because obviously I don't have HTTPS on my local environment. It's not worth the hassle of setting up because you can't access it outside of my network. So who cares? Unless my roommates are trying to hack my to-do app. So, who knows, it could happen, but so with all that set, we just want to make sure that we set the path to /, which just means that this cookie is going to be available anywhere on the site, which is super important because we want to go to other pages to get this data, which we'll go to in a moment. So we just set the we set the cookie, and then we hit throw a redirect to the profile page. So I go in here, and then let's just put in my gmail.com, and then I think this was the thing I used. Perfect. So that's it. So I just made John Doe. I made this user last night. So you go in here and we go to this me page, and then suddenly I'm getting all this information. So you remember from earlier that session we set. This is the data from the session because we're fetching that from the me endpoint. So what I'm doing is I'm grabbing the ID, the first name, the last name, the email, etc. Super nice, super powerful. So how is this actually working? We go into the me page. We have, once again, client and server. You got a really important thing that I know I'm hammering this a lot, but as you get better, you need to get a very clear mental distinction of the client and of the server. I've tried to make videos about this in the past, but they ended up not coming out super well. And I think I'm going to need to try and figure out how to distill this information in the future. But for now, remember, page.svelte is all client side, and then page.server is server side. So again, here, this is just the This is the me page. This is what's showing up here. I'm just checking if the data is actually fetched, because it's possible that we can go to this page, not have a session, and then there'd be nothing to fetch. So I'm checking to see if we have the data. If I do, I print it out. Then on the server here, we just have our load function. So what it's doing in here is it's yelling at me because it's just a type error. I don't know why event is yelling at me here. It does obviously clearly work. It's just a type thing. I think it's just the Svelte VS Code extension being weird. You could import this from the $types package or whatever, but I'll just leave the red thing there for now. It's whatever. So this right here is the load function. It's going to be basically the server side get request. So basically this will all be executed server side. So if we go to the me page, we don't have a session, obviously it gets sent to sign in. And then if we do have a session, we're going to make a request to localhost users me. So let's take a look at that users me route. The users me route is actually really, really simple, because all we have to do is just pull the session out of the database. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to first get the user information. So we just pull the header off of our authorization thing. Remember, we just set that header back on the server side of the client. Terms get weird, but we get the authorization header, we pull all this stuff out, and then we grab our session ID. So once we grabbed our session ID, we're going to go ahead and just run session manager.getSession. And this get session method is as dumb simple as you think it is. It's literally just grab the session from our database and then unmarshal the session into the user session object, which is really just telling it that it needs to have this format of ID, first name, last name, email. Then we go ahead back in here, and then we just send that down to the end user. And then on our client over here, all it has to do is just take this down as the response body, and then just send that down to the end users, because this page.server is just a data fetch, and then we just send that down to our client, and then we display it out here. So that's authentication. That's a very brief overview of all of it. I know it might not. It's a very brief overview of sign in and me. There are more endpoints I implemented here, like the sign out method. So if I hit logout, that'll redirect me to the logout page, which redirects me to the sign in page. Really, all I'm doing here is I'm just doing some fancy tricks with sign out. So I have a server route here, but I'm being fancy with this because there's no page thing, but the load function calls anytime you go to a route, and it's basically just a get request. So anytime I go to like /sign out, it'll call this load function. So I can just use this load function to send down data. And it basically just gives me a server side function I can use for this. It's the kind of fancy thing you can do with these frameworks once you get a really good mental model and understanding of where things are running, how all of it works. But there's a lot that goes into that. You need to understand HTTP, you need to understand get versus post, you need to understand the browser headers, all this. I mean, there's a lot of crap that goes into it. Figuring out how to distill that into clean videos is going to be a huge challenge for me over this summer, but I'm going to try and do it. I think Svelte is the one that I want to do with this. I'm absolutely loving this framework. More videos to come on this, obviously. So with all that out of the way, that very long example, this ended up being way longer than I kind of wanted it to be, but oops. So how do I feel about authentication? So custom rolling your own auth is, as you saw there, it's not nearly as hard as a lot of people think it is, but it's also not trivial. It's kind of weird, and there's a lot you have to think about and a lot you have to understand. And there really is something beautiful and nice about having the clerk package where I just throw it in there and it just works. It'll just handle everything I need. No real effort on my end. But the problem that you have with this is these things get really, really expensive really, really fast. So that's the main reason why I looked into just custom rolling auth and stuff like that. Is I've got a project coming up soon that I'm working on my own. It's my new startup and a bunch of stuff. Really, really excited about it. I cannot wait to show you guys all that stuff. Hopefully someday we'll have some stuff open sourced about it and a bunch of really cool videos. I'm very excited for that. But the point is, this is an app that's going to need and require and have a ton of users. And like clerk pricing is 2 cents per monthly active user. And that might not sound like too much, but especially in a B2C type application where a lot of your users aren't necessarily going to be paying, especially early on, that's really, really bad. If you have 10,000 users, you're paying a lot for just your users bill. And then the more you scale, the more insane that gets. So I was looking at this and I'm like, I feel like I should just roll it myself. And it also allows me to do things like it just kind of gives you more flexibility, and that's a constant trade-off that you have. And really the theme of everything should just be everything is trade-offs. I mean, Svelte versus Next, it's trade-offs. Go versus Laravel versus a Next backend, it's trade-offs. But the trade-offs here for the authentication is you get the ease of use, you also get some extra features which are admittedly really nice. You get built-in user management, you get the ability to set user metadata, you get really great libraries custom built for all the frameworks you want. Well, if that framework is React, with frameworks with services like Auth0 or Clerk or whatever. These features are awesome. These features are great. They will help you a ton, but they're expensive and they're limiting. You do not have full control over your authentication. You do not own your users, and you are dependent on them. If you want to migrate off an Auth platform, good luck. It sucks. And you end up having to set up your data model in a way that you have this external dependency. And I don't know how I feel about that. This is something that I really go back and forth on. And I think at the end of the day, you really just have to answer the question, is it worth the effort to go through and custom roll this? It's cheaper. It's probably more performant, all things considered, because it's just all in one database and it's all in your own custom thing, especially if you're using a highly performant framework like Go or something like that. It's going to be cheaper, it's going to be quicker, but it's going to be harder. So is that trade-off worth it? Really only you can decide. Hopefully this little introduction helps you out. If you made it through this behemoth of a video, I really appreciate it. I will talk to you guys very soon with the next part of this, where we're going to be working on fetching the data up and down for the to-dos. Then we're going to start looking into hosting, regions, how all this stuff works. Hope you guys enjoyed. Have a great day.